Clerk, word of the Greens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Attorney, yesterday during the Commission of Inquiry into the Tasmanian Government's responses to child sexual abuse in institutional settings, Counsel Assisting Marie Norton said, "We will examine concerns regarding the Tasmanian Government's lack of response to key recommendations of the National Royal Commission. In particular, limited progress has been made on the introduction of a reportable conduct scheme or the implementation of the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations, which were endorsed by COAG in 2019. Attorney, why haven't these key recommendations been acted upon? And can you tell the House when they will be? When will the House see, for example, a legislation implementing a child-safe organisation framework? Also, what is the time frame for full implementation of the Royal Commission's recommendations?"
Honourable Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Leader of the Greens, Ms O'Connor, for her question. Now, as the Premier has rightly pointed out, of the 409 recommendations from the Royal Commission, that was the National Royal Commission, into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, 307 are relevant to Tasmania. The remainder are relevant only to other jurisdictions, the federal government or non-government religious institutions. I'm pleased to report that 198 recommendations have been substantially or fully implemented, with the remaining matters continuing to be progressed. I just want to explain this before I get to your child safe
and the time frame
question. Of these outstanding recommendations, they are of a complex legal nature that involves substantial reforms to existing systems. For example, the need to appropriately balance privacy of individuals with the information sharing elements that underpin a significant proportion of these remaining recommendations, or they are multifaceted recommendations that need to be considered in the Tasmanian context. However, the scoping and analysis work is underway to ensure these recommendations can be effectively implemented in Tasmania to achieve the intended outcomes, which is obviously to protect the safety of Tasmania's children. This is complicated work, Mr Speaker, and it's important that we do not rush it. We need to make sure that the changes are appropriate and that we get it right. Now, that obviously brings me to stating in relation to your question about child-safe organisations. We've already committed to obviously introducing a legislative framework which ensures organisations providing services for children prevent and appropriately respond to child sexual abuse. The draft Child Safe Organisations Bill of 2020, which proposes to create a standalone piece of legislation and establish the principles for the safety and wellbeing of children and child safe standards, was released for public consultation between 22nd December last year and the 19th of February this year. The bill outlines the proposed approach to implementing key recommendations of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse by establishing the principles for the safety and wellbeing of children and the child safe standards.
Why is it taking so long?
I'm getting to that, Ms O'Connor. The 22 submissions received are currently being reviewed by the Department of Justice, with options continuing to be developed in order to be provided to government for consideration. Along with the Minister for Children and Youth, I've recently met with the Victorian Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People and the Tasmanian Commissioner for Children and Young People, and that meeting was at the request of our Children's Commissioner, to learn more about the Victorian model and consider any further options that may be suitable for the Tasmanian context. Now, I think it's important that we take that Victorian model into consideration. It was as a direct result of our Commissioner for Children and Young People, and that the draft legislation that we currently have put out for public consultation might need to be amended to suit that better model. I have spoken, Mr Speaker, I have spoken to our, I'll just shorten it, to Children's Commissioner about this, and we would prefer to have a much better framework and piece of legislation and ensure that we adequately consult on that with any further submissions that need to be made. We will get that work done as quickly as possible. I intend to ensure that we have legislation before this House despite the work of the Commission of Inquiry, and it may well be, once there are recommendations coming out of the Commission of Inquiry, that further work may need to be done to that at a later stage. But we will not be delaying that. The only delay has been to ensure that we have a model that is best practice, best standard across our nation, and to that end, I have been asked by our Children's Commissioner to look at the Victorian model, and that's exactly what
Royal
we are
Commission
doing.
findings. You didn't answer the question
Independent
about when
Member
you're going to
Clark.
recommend all the recommendations.
Johnson.
Thank you for your answer, but would be likely to do that.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Attorney, you are well aware that Tasmania has the weakest integrity laws in the country. We now have a Tasmanian Electoral Commission report which finds that successive Tasmanian governments may have carried out, and I use the Commission's words, indirect electoral bribery through the distribution of grants at election time. But the Integrity Commission also found that the TEC has been hamstrung by a lack of specific powers and resources to the extent that it is not possible for it to enforce compliance with our corrupt practices provisions of the Tasmanian Electoral Act. Attorney, surely you agree this is a disgraceful state of affairs. Attorney, will you guarantee the proposed Electoral Matters Bill will provide real teeth and direction for the TEC to investigate corrupt practices? And Attorney, will you immediately approve adequate funding for the Tasmanian Electoral Commission to carry out its statutory responsibilities? It will be a start in restoring public faith in the political process.
Honourable Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the independent member for Clark, Ms Johnston, for her question. Now, Mr Speaker, the Government of course notes the release of the Integrity Commission summary paper regarding Tasmania's Electoral Act offences and campaign conduct. As is always the case, we'll consider the report. It's usual practice. However, it is important to note that we're already taking action to strengthen the Electoral Act with feedback on the two bills that we have released for public consultation out there, namely the Electoral Disclosure and Funding Bill 2021 and the Electoral Matters Miscellaneous Amendments Bill 2021. Like every political party and candidate, we take into account a range of views when developing election policies. This includes getting out on the ground in local communities and hearing firsthand what they need to thrive into the future. Claiming that there is something less than fair about the practice of any one person promising funding to local communities facilities is disingenuous. Mr Speaker, I asked the member for Clark, which local community facilities fund that we had in 2021 initiative funded in Clark, for example, that you wouldn't support.
Yep. Where are the cuts?
So which of the, there was $165,000
Order.
$20,000 to
Order. I can't hear the attorney. Order.
$114,000 provided in the budget for upgrading the toilet facilities and resurfacing of the car park area at Glenorchy Community Care. Was that election bribery? I mean, Mr Speaker, is the member now saying there was something untoward about those promises that were made? Is she saying in seeking reform in this area that a third independent party like the Tasmanian Electoral Commission or the Integrity Commission should have a say prior to any election promise being made by a candidate during an election campaign?
Wow, who wrote this?
Now, Mr Speaker,
This is not your best work.
Mr Speaker, this implements, the bill that we have out for public consultation implements recommendations as part of recommendation 1 and 2 of our electoral review final report for the benefit of the member who is now in this place. The final report makes 11 high-level recommendations for proposed reform to modernise our current system and create a political donations disclosure regime specifically for Tasmania. The review involved 2 rounds of public consultation and has already led to amendments to the Electoral Act, which commenced in 2019. Now, the recommendations in the final report broadly fall into 4 areas, namely recommendations of a technical nature that will ensure our electoral system is effective and contemporary, recommendations relating to a new disclosure regime for candidates and political parties, recommendations relating to the regulation of third-party campaigners, donors and associated entities, and a recommendation legislation in relation to the public funding of election campaigns. Mr Speaker, our government is committed to ensuring Tasmanians have confidence in our electoral system, and a key promise of this is ensuring that our electoral system is fair, transparent, effective and contemporary. That's why the government supports in principle all of the recommendations of that final report and has already commenced the preparation of urgent draft legislation. Now, Mr Speaker, I can advise the member for Clark that the Electoral Commission is working very closely with the Department of Justice on the development of this legislation. In relation to their capability and resourcing, as already advised previously when we announced our reforms, the Premier and Treasurer has discussed with the Tasmanian Electoral Commissioner and reassured him that all necessary resources will be made available to enable our reforms to occur. We understand that this will be a major change for the Tasmanian Electoral Commission, and we will consult closely with it on how best to transition to the new arrangements. Our government has always maintained that should the TEC require additional resources to carry out its functions, we will of course consider this through the normal budgetary processes. And I really do hope that the member for Clark, rather than just post on her Facebook pre-prepared Facebook post criticising the government, that she takes on board that we are acting in relation to electoral reform, that we have taken on board all of the recommendations of the Electoral Act Review final report, and that you don't just simply report what you want.
That's right.
Mr Speaker.